We've been going through in the sermon series this Advent about the different nativity set, and today we're going to add two more pieces to this, the ox and the ass. I did this in part just so that Gloria would have to say the word ass all week long in the church office. It's not a donkey though, right? The ox and the ass, two people, or animals I should say, that we maybe don't think about often at Christmas, but is a consistent part of each nativity scene. And we'll explore that today. Often, as Beth was just saying, if we look at a picture of Advent, right, we often see a series of animals around. And in part, this is to emphasize the lowliness of Christ's birth, the fact that he was born in a place for animal. But also, over the time period, each of these animals has come to symbolize certain things. There's a certain cast of characters. If we're going through the characters of Christmas, the animals definitely play a part and are a part of that image. Now, this might be a little surprising to you because if you look at the Gospel of Luke, for instance, there are not actually animals in the Gospel of Luke. And in fact, some of that is our own interpretation of it because, as we all know from the story, part of what we do, though, when we go back to the text is we realize that there are a lot of legends or stories that have evolved around the Christmas story. And this image of being in a sort of barn, which we think of as this image, is actually part of that legend that we have, for instance. And it comes back from the original translation of the Bible into English, into the King James Version. So this is another thing. If you go to other cultures, for instance, they don't have this legend or image of a barn. Part of it is just a one-word translation that happened in the King James. So if we look at the King James, what it specifically says, right, is Mary laid him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. Kataluma is that word that's translated for inn. Kataluma, that word in Greek. But kataluma doesn't necessarily mean inn. In fact, in no other place in the New Testament is kataluma actually translated as inn. And when you look at words for inn, for instance, when the Good Samaritan takes the injured man and places him in an inn, that's a totally different word that they use for the word inn. This word kataluma is used, though, for instance. For example, when Jesus sends his disciples into Jerusalem to find a place for the final supper, he asks them to find a kataluma, by which he did not mean an inn necessarily. An inn would have been a fairly rough arrangement of things, perhaps not so scrupulous, also somewhat dishonorable at this time period, which we'll get to, but would have meant a guest room, or, as we often think of it, an upper room. So if you look at more modern translations of the Bible, for instance, they almost always translate it this way. Mary placed him in a manger because there was no guest room available for him. And that makes sense according to this culture. One of the things we talked about a couple weeks ago when we talked about Joseph is how important Joseph was for Jesus in that culture, because the father's family, or the stepfather's family, the adopted family in this instance, was an extended network of relatives, which would have been really important to anyone growing up in this culture, in which your extended network of relatives was a support system for you and a way in which you could involve yourself and be situated within a community. And so when Joseph went to this hometown for this census, it would have been scandalous indeed if he had stayed at an inn. Such a thing would never have happened. Now, I don't know about you, but I will say, this is an aside, one of the truly transformative moments in my life was when I realized when my parents came to visit, they could stay in a hotel instead of with me for 7 days. Sorry, parents. This is true. This is true life advice. Everyone gets along better when mom goes home to her own hotel at the end of the night. But in this culture, that would have been scandalous to stay in an inn. It would have been a drastic insult. And maybe as I'm saying this, you're thinking it's an insult to my mother as well. Trust me, she's happier in the hotel. But in this culture, that would have been an insult. You would have always stayed with your relatives. The inn was for people who had no one else, like that wounded man on the side of the road. The inn was for someone who had no one else. Always you stayed with your relatives. So what they're saying here, I think, in this passage is that when Joseph goes home, he stays. Once again, his role as the father of Jesus is already there, that he's staying with his relatives. And with them, there would have been no guest room. Now, if you look at a typical house from this time period, and here there's a couple of slides, sorry. The first slide is an actual sort of diorama that you can go see at sort of Harvard Seminary, which is sort of famous. It's really hard to see maybe on a screen, but maybe you can get a sense that there's two levels there. And on the upper level was the place where they would stay, the bedrooms, so to speak. There would have been a bedroom, one bedroom for the main family. If you were really wealthy, you had two bedrooms for the main family so that the parents could have their own room. And then there would have been this guest room, this kataluma. Maybe the next slide makes it easier to see that. I don't know, it's a little difficult to see perhaps, but you can see the rooms upstairs. And on the bottom floor would have been a room for storage of food, storage of goods perhaps that you were trading in, storage of things that you would have been passing through your house, and then a room that would have been for animals. Of course, in a culture in which there is no central heat, this would also have been an important factor. To sleep above the animals was in fact the warmest place in the house. And so I think what they're saying here when they say there's no kataluma for them, there's no guest room for them there, what they're saying is that Joseph and Mary and Jesus was born not in the barn behind an inn, but on the first floor. The second floor was full, which would make sense once again if Joseph's whole family is coming to Bethlehem for the census, that the house would have been packed to overflowing, and that they would have been born in this, I don't know what you call it, a stable, I guess is what you might call it, but it's not quite a barn, but the room for the animals down below. And so the animals would have been present there in that particular moment. Now, I don't know about you, but I've never thought much about the ox and the ass at a nativity scene. In fact, when I came to this section for the nativity, I sort of thought to myself, I don't know, is this really a thing? Is there always an ox and an ass? And then I looked at our nativity scene. Sure enough, we do. We have several nativity scenes at home. I pulled them out. They all have an ox and an ass attached to them. I see them now around town. Now I can't help but see ox and asses everywhere. I also went back through and went through all these pictures. You know me, I love like pictures of the past, and I noticed, sure enough, in all these nativity scenes, there's always kind of the ox and the ass in the background. In fact, I came to think of them in my own mind. I'm going to date myself here as a bit like these two characters for some reason. They're like always there in the background, and now I picture them saying catty little comments to each other all the time about it. So you'll see what I mean. Like here are some pictures of the nativity, sort of famous art historical pictures. You see, there they are in the background, like just sitting there. Even when there's nobody else in the picture, they're just kind of sitting there, and I picture them kind of making jokes to each other. Or this one, they're definitely, right? I mean, come on, they look like they're making fun of the whole operation. By the way, I have no idea why Jesus is lying on the ground here. This is not exactly great parenting. Maybe that's what they're making fun of. Or this one in particular, I feel like, see, they're like giving each other the Jim Halpert eyes at the camera, right? Like they're totally cynical about what's happening here. But they're always there in that image. The ox and the ass always in the background, which is kind of interesting because, as I've mentioned before, it's not in any of the New Testament accounts. Where does this come from, this tradition of the ox and the ass? It's also in our carols, by the way. I'm going to attempt to sing now. Please do not laugh at me. This is not the part of the sermon where you should laugh, but like good Christian men rejoice has it. Ox and ass before him bow, and in the manger now Christ is born today. Hey, Christ is born today. Or what child is this, which we'll sing afterwards. It's kind of strange. When we did Joseph, there wasn't a single carol I could find with Joseph in it. The ox and the ass, though, like every carol, right? Why lies he in such mean estate, where ox and ass are feeding? Or the little drummer boy. Mary nodded, pa-rum-pa-pum-pum. The ox and ass kept time, pa-rum-pa-pum-pum. The last time I heard that at a choir at school, I noticed that they changed it to the ox and the lamb because the kids couldn't say the word ass without laughing. So I congratulate you on being more mature than the elementary school kids who were singing that song. So they're always there. They're always in the background. Where does this come from? Well, it is once again, like many of these things, an old tradition. The earliest account that we have of Jesus' birth that's not in the Bible comes from the 2nd century in something called the Proto-Gospel of Matthew. And it includes this statement that the ox and the ass were there. But probably the one person who we owe this tradition to the most is Origen. Origen is one of the earliest church fathers. He's an Egyptian from Alexandria. And by far, we often think of the church where Paul went into Greece and to Rome, but by far, the place where the church took off the most was in Africa, early on. And Origen is one of these African theologians, just like Augustine was an African theologian. And he's the first person to actually go back as a Greek person and understand Hebrew and to compile the Old Testament into Hebrew and to write extensive commentaries about the Old Testament for the early church. They were used as the basis for preaching and for study across the Roman world. Then there's an irony here too, because Origen, like many Christians throughout period, I hate to tell you this, but Origen hated Christmas. He thought it was a horrible idea. Only Romans celebrated births. If you think about it, this is not a Jewish thing. They celebrate circumcisions. They don't celebrate births. And so he thought this was kind of a weird habit that the Greeks had of celebrating Christmas. But nevertheless, when he wrote about all the Gospels, one of the things that he would do is he had this tradition that we call the fifth gospel tradition, which is to say that much like the people who wrote the New Testament themselves, he looked at Isaiah and he wove as much as Isaiah into his understanding of Christ as humanly possible. And one of the passages that he thought really spoke to Christ was right there in the beginning of Isaiah. In the beginning of Isaiah, Isaiah is preaching to Israel, which is about to go into captivity, and is telling them that there's an irony here that the very people God has chosen to be his people have nevertheless completely turned their back on him. They don't know him at all. They've fallen away and they've gone to their own way. And here we have this verse, Isaiah 1:3. The ox knows its owner, and the ass its master's manger, but Israel does not know. My people do not understand. And this is where that image or that tradition of the ox and the ass being there. Of course, I mean, how could Origen not? He sees that word manger. He connects it, right, with the gospel story. He understands Christ is in the master's manger. And Israel does not recognize him. He came unto his own, and his own did not receive him. But who does know? The pets, the ox and the ass. They know their owners. They know the master's manger. In this sense, they are one up on Israel itself. And this is so true for many of those at the nativity scene, right? As we think about what the ox and the ass means for us too, when we see them in a nativity scene, things that they say about the Christmas story, I can think of three things. And the first is, they speak to the attitude of the receptivity of the animals and all the people at the manger scene versus the unreceptive rulers and priests of Israel. Notice who's not in any nativity scenes. If any of you have a nativity scene with King Herod in it, please let me know. I bet you he's not there, right? If any of you have a nativity scene with a high priest or a temple official, let me know. They're not there. They don't recognize that Christ is born. Instead, who is there? The outsiders, right? Mary and Joseph, this poor couple going through the scandalousness of being pregnant even though unwed. Shepherds, the dirtiest of the lot. The people who don't even own the sheep that they patrol, but who live out on the hillside and rarely come into town, rarely socialize with people. These three foreign astronomers, I mean, they're not only foreign, but they're astronomers, as we'll see. They're the kind of the ultimate outsider. What are they doing there at the nativity scene? And the ox and the ass fit into that template. When Christ is born, throughout his entire life, the people who see Christ for who he really is are those who are lost, those who are on the fringe, those who are on the outside of society, and those who are the most resistant to Christ. Just as it says in Isaiah 1, the people who do not know and do not understand are the people who are on the inside, right? Mary understood this when she got the message from Gabriel. I mean, note her response. It's all about people on the fringe being empowered and those who are in power in Israel being cast down. Her response is, my soul magnifies the Lord. All generations will call me blessed, for the mighty one has done great things to me, and holy is his name. And then listen to this. God has shown strength with God's arm. God has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. God has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. God has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. She understood in a moment what Christ's kingdom means for the poor and what it means for those who are wealthy and powerful. And so the ox and the ass testify to this. They have no power, they have no standing, they're not even human. And yet, as Isaiah says, they know the master's manger. They know their owner. There is something in animals that knows God in a way that many of us try hard not to know. The second thing, the symbols that are there that Origen would point to, is that they're a mixture of clean and unclean. Now, I assume the rest of you are not reading Leviticus on late at night and don't go through, but if you go through, anytime the ass is mentioned, it's always as sort of an unclean animal, something that has to be taken care of or cleansed, or it's necessary for work, but it's something that's always on the outside of society. In fact, it would have been very unlikely, historically speaking, that there would be an ass or a donkey living in a house in Israel because it was such an unclean animal. And by contrast, the ox was one of the cleanest animals that was frequently used for sacrifice and is often used as a metaphor for Israel itself. And so what Origen and the early church saw was this connection. The ox and the ass are not just two random animals picked, but one is clean and represents Israel, and one is unclean and actually represents Gentiles. One of the commandments in Deuteronomy 22, for instance, is where we get this language. I don't know if you've heard this is kind of church speak, but don't be unequally yoked. I mean, Jesus uses that language, right? Like, don't be unequally yoked. If you're a thoroughbred, don't yoke yourself to, a crippled pig. This is not a good image. But that actually is a quotation of Deuteronomy 22, in which it says that unequally yoked is do not yoke an ox and a donkey together. Do not put the ox and the ass together. These two animals in particular are meant to be kept apart. And if you think about it in the life of a farm, right, they have very different functions, right? But they're not to be put together. So the fact that they are together at Christ's manger, Origen saw and the early church saw and the symbol still states, is not just that the outside is being brought in, or that these animals understand and know what the wealthy and the powerful do not, but that both Jew and Gentile are yoked together. They are there together at Christ's birth. The third symbol that this was used for was a way of understanding Christ's birth as the hinge or the turning point or the pivot, if you will, of all of human history. We just read John 1 at the beginning, right? And that language just is so reminiscent of Genesis 1, and that's not an accident. In Genesis 1, you have God creating the world and bringing all the animals and all of life into being. And in John 1, you have the exact same language because that is how Christ is to be understood. Christ is the first of the new creation. In him and in his birth, all of the universe, all of creation is redeemed and restored. This is probably seen most eloquently in the opening section of Colossians, where Paul writes about Christ as the image of the invisible God, the firstborn for all creation. Lest you think our redemption in God involves us alone. It does not. It involves the entire universe being set right and put to function in the way that God created it. Paul continues on in Colossians by saying that Christ is before all things, and in him all things hold together, for in him the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and God was pleased to reconcile to himself all things. He ends by saying, right, that he urges them in Colossians to be steadfast in the faith without shifting from the hope promised by the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven. Notice that he does not say, Paul rarely ever says to every human under heaven, but to every creature. Now, maybe we don't think about this, right? For certainly when I think of the angels appearing to the shepherds, for instance, I think of the angels as talking to the shepherds. But is it possible that they're also talking to the sheep? There is a way in which creation itself is groaning. The animals, too, suffer the weight of human sin. The animals, too, suffer the weight of a world that has gone horribly wrong. And God's promise of reconciliation and redemption is not just for us as humans, but to every creature under heaven. And so the inclusion of the ox and the ass of the nativity scene to me is also a reminder that Christ came to die not just for the shepherd, and not just for the foreign astronomer, and not just for Mary and Joseph of Jesse's lineage, but for the animals that are there as well, that all things may be set right. So the ox and the ass are not just a sort of incidental incorporation into the nativity scene, but they remind us of these three things. That God comes for the outsiders, for those who know in their heart their master's manger, not for the wealthy and powerful. That God intends to yoke together the clean and the unclean, the Gentile and the Jew, the insider and the outsider. And that Christ's birth is not just tremendously good news for us as individual humans and for us as the people of God, but for the entire universe, the ox and the ass included. Amen. Our Father, as we reflect upon your birth at this season, help us to understand the truly cosmic importance of you, the firstborn of a new creation that has come to give all things life and all things redemption. Help us to participate in this redemption in the course of our lives and to be grateful for it this Christmas above all else. In your name we pray. Amen.